The aftershocks of the COVID-19 pandemic, climate change and Russia's invasion of Ukraine are shaking up African economies and making it harder for people to keep their heads above water. This as the prices of food, fuel and transport continue to rise. African governments are now finding themselves with limited resources to support their citizens through this financial crisis. Let's discuss further now with One Campaign's policy officer, Olawunmi Ola-Busari. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. She joins us live from Pretoria. It really is the perfect, if I could use a positive word, the perfect cocktail that's the world really finds itself in. It's not every day that you see on international news the Western powers talking about a crisis in the cost of living. And that, of course, means in places, in countries across Africa where putting food on the table was already an ongoing struggle, that things are far worse. To start our conversation, let's talk about how we got here, how we got to these different parts of this now very worrying cocktail.
Yes, thank you so much for having me, Marcelle. How we got here is really a cumulative process related to the three crises that are converging that you mentioned, that of COVID, that of climate change, and now that of conflict with Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And what we're seeing is from the time that COVID-19 started, we have seen a sharp increase in food commodity prices as the pandemic and the lockdowns that followed it brought disruptions in supply chains. And what we have continued to see is millions of people are struggling to stay afloat in the turbulent waters of rising food insecurity that have been compounded by increased unemployment due to COVID lockdowns, and now more disruption of supply chains of staple goods such as wheat, maize, and sunflower oil because of the destabilization of Russia and Ukraine. So in 2021, there were 193 million people in urgent need of food assistance. And if that was, a country in the world, it would be the 8th largest country in the world. And since the Russian invasion of Ukraine, we have over 40 million people more that are experiencing hunger. So, it's a lot of factors at play. We also then have droughts, the effects of droughts in parts of our world, for example, in the Horn of Africa, experiencing some of the worst droughts and therefore depleting the continent's own agricultural productivity. I can also point to the recent floods in KZN in the Eastern Cape. Yeah. So it is, as you said, a perfect storm. Yes.
Indeed. If we could spend just a little bit of time looking at the latest crisis that was added to that brewing storm, as it were, the crisis involving Russia's invasion of Ukraine. I think many people can be forgiven in this part of the world for thinking, this is going to be a war that takes place on the other side of the globe. It's not really going to impact us. Boy, have so many people been proven wrong, that in how the economies of the world is set up, you can't just have an isolated storm that you build a proverbial wall around and hope that it blows over. Every little pebble in it, we're really using a lot of a lot of sayings here tonight. Every little pebble in the stream will cause some kind of ripple, even across Africa. Do you think people, governments across Africa were prepared for the impact that the crisis in that part of Europe has had on the countries across the continent?
I will say that it would have been very hard for them to be prepared. They were still, a lot of African governments are still recovering, struggling to recover from the economic aftershocks of the COVID-19 pandemic. And the Russian invasion of Ukraine has sort of taken us out of the frying pan and into the fire. And what we have is, we might think it's a war that is far away from us, but really it's affecting our daily lives because of the interdependent nature of globalization. So Russia and Ukraine supply about 50% of Africa's wheat imports. And for certain countries, including Eritrea, Egypt, Benin, Sudan, Djibouti, Tanzania, they make up over 70% of wheat imports. And so I'm sure when the invasion took place, those in African governments that understand these dependencies would have realized the significance of that moment, and that it would further destabilize the economic recovery of their countries.
One would think that food security would be the main concern going forward. What, in your opinion, should be the top priority for the leaders across the continent to ensure that enough people are more food secure, taking into consideration that as a result of the pandemic, so many more people joined that long list of people who find themselves below the breadline?
Yes, there are many objectives for African countries in particular, and for all countries facing this cost of living crisis. In the immediate term, what is important is for us to take action against food insecurity. And this means committing to avoiding export bans on key commodities. So we've seen Russia, we've seen Ukraine put export restrictions on food. And even African countries, including Algeria and Egypt, have also introduced export restrictions. But if we all close in, then we leave less for our neighbors. And so we need to remember to not only think of ourselves, because that makes the situation worse. The other important point is that when food insecurity becomes an issue, it is the most vulnerable in our societies that are most affected. It is the low-income households. It is the women in these low-income households. And so countries need to target subsidies and social protection to the most vulnerable. We know that before the pandemic, women were 6% more likely than men to experience hunger. But at the height of the pandemic, it was 10%. And surely we expect that now they are also being hit harder. And for low-income households for whom food makes up a larger portion of their consumption expenditure, they have less to spend on other essentials, such as education or healthcare costs, or even transport, which is now also skyrocketing. So we really need to target subsidies and social protection to the most vulnerable. As a global community, we need to fully fund the World Food Program and the UN's humanitarian appeals to respond to the food crisis. We also need to support efforts to create a humanitarian corridor to facilitate grain exports from Ukraine to the rest of the world. And in our individual capacities, we can do more to support grassroots organizations that are working to provide food to vulnerable communities, knowing that we are always capable of being there for ourselves. We are the ones we should look to first. And in the long run, what is important is that we fund the economic recovery of African countries, that we stop the debt crisis that is happening right now in African countries, and that we accelerate climate action on the African continent. So right now, so many African countries are experiencing debt distress. They're struggling to pay off their debts, their sovereign debts. And so we need to see the international community and multilateral development banks make it easier to access special drawing rights and other forms of liquidity, and to apply for debt restructuring through the G20 common framework. So we need to see some reform that really keeps the competing priorities of developing countries in mind.
Okay, we're going to leave it there. Thank you so much for your insight. That's Olawunmi Ola-Busari. She is the One Policy officer joining us live there from Pretoria. We thank her for her time this evening.